everybody. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we meet tonight on Whadjuk Noongar land, and that the Whadjuk Noongar people are the original owners and the spiritual and cultural custodians of this country. My name's Ted Snell, and I'm delighted to be the host of such a wonderful panel. You will have noticed that taking a leaf out of Tony Abbott's cabinet decisions recently, we've reversed them, and I am the only man on the panel. But that's the sort of gender balance that I like. Okay, the session tonight is co-hosted by Arts Law and also by NAVA, and the theme is Contested Art, the Battle for Public Space. I looked up, of course, as one does, I googled artistic freedom today, and I found a wonderful quote from Christo. "A work of art is a scream of freedom." And from Albert Camus, "Without freedom there is no art. Art lives only on the restraints it imposes on itself and dies of all others." So these are the themes that we're going to be talking about tonight. How artists work, particularly within public space, how they determine the level of freedom, how they work within the constraints that are imposed upon them, and how they explore art in that public realm. And what a fantastic panel we have to tackle this interesting question. First of all, Robin Ayres, the Executive Director of Arts Law. I'm sure Robin is known to you all. She's been working in the field for over 20 years and has been such an important participant in all the discussions around professional development for artists and rights of artists. Tamara Winikoff is probably the iconic figure of the visual arts in this country, the advocate par excellence, who all of us know has done so much for artists in this country and continues to do so. She is putting on her armour to do battle with Sir George Brandis as we speak. Kelly McCuskey is well known to everybody in Western Australia, of course as the co-founder of PBI, and of course also of the Centre for Interdisciplinary Arts, the CIA. I see your CV says you're the head girl at the CIA. Love it. And Lady Bananas, a Fremantle-based freelance artist and public art activist. Now the panel is first of all going to speak for 5 minutes, give you an introduction. There seems to be a bit of feedback. Is that just because I'm too close, or no? It's just happening. It's going to give you a 5-minute introduction to some ideas that will act as a catalyst for our further discussion in a panel straight after that's spoken. And first of all, I would like to introduce Robin Ayres, ladies and gentlemen.
Thanks, Ted, and good evening, everyone. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Arts Law Centre of Australia and what we do there and how we might be able to help you rather. And I'm really just on the panel to field questions that might deal with the legal issues, because they're quite many and varied when we get into this space of public art, and particularly the areas that Lady Bananas and Kelly are going to talk about. And as you're probably aware, Arts Law Centre is the National Community Legal Centre for the Arts. So we give legal advice to artists and arts organisations right around the country, not only in the visual arts area, but also performing arts, music, writing, filmmaking, so right across the genres as well. And we deal with a really broad range of legal issues. So it won't be a surprise for you to learn that in this area that we're talking about this evening, we cover a really huge range of issues when we're thinking about freedom of expression and art in public spaces. So we traverse things like, we were just talking before about permit systems and councils and all of those sort of regulations around public art, to the graffiti laws in Western Australia, and we've recently seen stuff around that's happening in child pornography. So it's a very varied legal landscape that you are going to have to traverse, and the role of Arts Law really is to be there to give legal advice and legal assistance to artists and arts organisations whatever your legal problems might be relating to your arts practice. So probably that's all I need to say just to start with. That's what Arts Law does, and I've got some brochures here for everybody to take with them. And also for artists, so you know that the advice that we give over the telephone is a free service. For arts organisations, you have to subscribe, but it's still quite low cost. But for artists, it's free, so you can ring up and get some advice on any legal issue that's affecting you, whether it be in this sort of freedom of expression era or copyright or the lease you're taking out on your studio or whatever it is. So enough for me to start.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah, great. Thanks. Well, as Ted mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the National Association for Visual Arts, which is the peak body that represents the professional interests of visual and media arts, crafts and design practitioners in Australia. And we undertake a whole range of tasks on behalf of the visual arts sector, including advocacy and provision of services and setting the standards for the industry. So in a way, similarly to Arts Law, but not about the law, we provide direct services to artists in many, many areas of your practice. And tonight, I'm just going to talk a little bit about our experience with some of the things that can happen. As you probably know, you may not know, freedom of expression, while it's understood to be one of the most fundamental of democratic rights, it actually isn't protected by law in Australia. And there was a move to try to bring in a Bill of Rights a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago, but as you probably know if you watch the news, that wasn't successful. So currently, freedom of expression, while everybody presumes that it's a right that needs to be respected, isn't actually well protected in Australia, and we have a lot of examples of where things can go wrong. Currently, NABA is trying to talk to the police about setting up some protocols so that if something happens where there's a complaint, instead of the police going straight in and confiscating the work, that at least they would take some advice from an expert panel before making that decision. But those are ongoing, those negotiations. I also wanted to let you know about this publication that NABA produces called the Art Censorship Guide. It was precipitated by the Bill Henson affair that I'm sure I don't need to go into in any detail, but it does actually extend much further than the particular issues that were raised by the Bill Henson experience. So what this book covers is an explanation of what freedom of expression and censorship is all about, advice on how to deal with it if it's likely to happen, if your work is contentious, or if it does happen, some case studies of things that have happened in Australia, and then a whole section on the laws that are most likely to impact on you. But of course, because artist practice is very diverse, it's almost limitless, the areas where you might be pulled up not expecting it. And I just wanted to give some examples of things that can happen. So this is the kind of advice that you'll find, that's a very schematic version of it, that you'll find in the guide, and we can come back to that. I just wanted to talk about a couple of examples of things that have happened which are not really clear-cut, where in the public domain we sort of come to the question of contested space and who prevails in that contestation. This is an example of a work by an artist that was painted on the wall of his own property, his studio, but it is actually straight onto the street, it abuts the street. And the artist is Sergio Redgol. By doing this, he has precipitated a lot of strong feeling about questions of what constitutes racial vilification or discrimination in Australia. And there have been protests, this work has been graffitied, it's been repainted, and the council did look to whether it was possible for them to take some action to prevent this from happening, but they found that actually the law, well, in fact, Robin may have some more things to say about that because she's the expert, but it's a difficult question when the public space is actually the visual space, but the private space is the physical space. So, you know, that sort of contestation over where you draw the line between whose jurisdiction it is a very interesting one. And this work remains today. Other areas of the law that can impact on artists, and that very frequently does, and there's a case right at this moment in Melbourne where an artist has been charged with child pornography over his work. But this is an area where there's particular sensitivity, and Bill Henson fell foul of that. But in the end he wasn't charged, and it was the case was dropped. But it did create a huge controversy and a lot of discussion. When we talk about the public realm, it's not only the realm of physical space, but it's also the intellectual space. And art magazines are another example of where censorship can occur. And this cover did cause controversy. It was right in the wake of the Bill Henson case, when Art Monthly published some really very interesting and thoughtful articles that they'd commissioned around the whole issue of freedom of expression, and they then were required to, they had to get the cover rated, and they got a rating which meant that they had to only distribute the magazine in a cover. So that's another example. This is an example where an artist was possibly going to be charged with sedition. Sedition, that law has subsequently changed, and NAVA was one of the bodies that was very vocal in trying to get that change, because essentially sedition prevents people from being critical of the government, the Constitution and the Queen, in a way that may be read to be fomenting violence. But now the law has been changed to be much more specific and doesn't prevent people critiquing, but it now is very much focused on just urging force or violence. However, at the time, the sedition law was still the law in Australia, and this artist had produced a work called, which he named Proudly I'm Australian. It opened on Australia Day. It was displayed in a public space because it was a billboard on the face of the gallery. So it was actually facing the street. And again, it's that, you know, the question of whether it's public or private space. It just so happened that the exhibiting of this work coincided with the Cronulla riots. So again, there was a lot of public sensitivity about what was happening to the Australian flag, ideas of national chauvinism, and there was the possibility that he was going to be charged. His work was censored and taken down and held by the police, but eventually after some weeks there was no charge. So, and I'll just give this as a last example, although there are many other areas where artists can fall foul of the law. This was an example of a young artist that actually, he'd done a work which was called The Exploding Portrait, as you can see, Portrait of the Exploding Terrorist, and part of his practice was to carry the work in the public space. And he was actually touring it right around Australia, well, showing it in various locations. And he was carrying it through the Brisbane Mall, and the Brisbane Council sent officers to tell him not to do it, and he said, why not? And they couldn't think of a good reason, so he then continued. But the following day he was stopped by the police on the grounds that he was causing a public nuisance. So what was actually going on was that the council was very sensitive about the subject matter, but the way that they prevented him from doing what he was doing was by calling it a public nuisance. And there are other examples, blasphemy, street art. And the street art does raise those difficult questions about whether it is artistic expression and or social political satire and or property damage. So once again, the public space is very much a contested space, and It depends which law is going to prevail at the time, what's going to happen to the artist. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tamara.
Okay. Right, so my name's Kelly and I am the co-founder of Perth-based arts group PVI Collective. PVI actually stands for Performance, Visual Art and Intervention, which are the three main areas of our practice when we established the group back in 1998. Our work is mostly situated in public spaces and operates from the participatory perspective of the audience, encouraging them to have a strong sense of agency within a work. We're not beholden to a particular art form and tend to allow the ideas to dictate the form. So our work has ranged from things like making bus tours to privacy services, public tug-of-war contests, iPhone apps and radio broadcasts. We often describe ourselves as making tactical media art, with our main tactic to use play and task-based interventions to explore the social dynamics of cities and the increasing restrictions placed on freedom of movement and individuality within the public sphere. When I was thinking about notions of freedom of expression and censorship in Australia in relation to contemporary arts practice in response to this forum, I got to thinking that it's an issue that's not quite as simple as it first appears. The concern for me, I think, is two main things. From our perspective of making work that is positioned in the public realm, we see a type of censorship happening on a much more subtle scale in this country and overseas. And by that I mean it's not quite as cut and dry as the outright banning of a work, criminalising an activity, or shutting down an exhibition. It's a little more insidious, and for us has included things like loose threats of cuts in funding, having our passports confiscated before we talk on television, editing out sections of artist statements in catalogues, increases in a range of fines relating to making work in public space, intimidation from private security firms and undercover police, and the escalation of complex permit processes. We often joke now when we're preparing for showing a new work, do we budget for fines or do we budget for permits? What's going to be the path of least resistance? So realising an idea has just made that little bit harder, to the point where maybe it ends up sitting in the too hard basket. I don't quite know if it's censorship in a true sense of the word. I don't quite know what you'd call it, but it's there and it's actually very powerful. And the other observation I made is that there is this worrying tendency to self-censor, either due to having experienced some of the above or having unclear assumptions about laws or regulations, or just because there is a genuine fear of unknown consequences. So it's as if this notion of censorship has maybe been internalised, and there's already an assumption that an idea is potentially dangerous or unlawful, which means that you could end up abandoning it before it even gets a public airing. That's definitely something that we've come up against. And I wanted to talk about one work in particular that we made where we had to negotiate some of this terrain and came out of it really quite surprised. And it relates to this event here, CHOGM, or the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is considered as one of the largest gatherings of world leaders, comprised of heads of states, foreign ministers, senior officials and heads of staff. In 2011, 54 countries were due to come together to discuss world issues and collectively agree on new policies. Luckily for us, in October 2011, it was coming to Planet Perth, along with Her Majesty the Queen. Now, we knew this was too juicy an opportunity to pass up undertaking some kind of intervention, but in the run-up to CHOGM, the controversial CHOGM Special Police Powers Act was passed, which we started to look into, as I think we really needed to know what exactly were the parameters we could operate in. The Police Powers Act was described by the Australian Lawyers Alliance as a wholesale suspension of human rights and a suspension of the rule of law. It meant that people could be stopped and searched without reasonable grounds for suspicion. CHOGM security zones were set up at 10-metre intervals through the city. Photography was banned in certain areas. Items such as marbles, poles, and offensive liquids were banned, and if you were caught with them, you were facing a $6,000 fine. Failure to disclose your personal identity or giving a false identity was considered an offence and came with a penalty of 12 months imprisonment. Electronic screening devices were in operation, and the use of force was also granted to police if they deemed it necessary. So our parameters were looking a little constrained, but not impossible, never impossible. Because during our research we came across this fantastic mandate from CHOGM, which, as you can see, said the country of the Commonwealth share a commitment to democracy, freedom, peace, the rule of law, and the opportunity for all. Well, we thought that was great, a really interesting claim given the Police Powers Act. So our response was to put that mandate to the test by devising a public game to play, which was this. CHOGM Who Cares was a limited edition card game of 54 sets of cards to match the amount of CHOGM leaders attending. Each pack contained a set of playing cards, including question cards, and a visual portfolio of all CHOGM visiting heads of state. As a player, you're invited to cut out and stick the images to match a CHOGM delegate with a dubious deed. Each card pack was handmade to fit into a lanyard that appropriated the CHOGM 2011 design scheme and the security pass colour coding. For us, the work was really about finding a way for some critical voices to be heard in light of the restrictions, but we also wanted to unearth some of the highly questionable activities reportedly undertaken by some of the Commonwealth leaders and their governments. There were some really shocking revelations, but also some quite funny disclosures, which range from things like, I've got some here, who has accepted investment funds from Colonel Gaddafi, who has ripped apart a cabbage during a public address, who is governing with no opposition, which Commonwealth leader has only 16 Facebook friends, who has used child soldiers during armed conflicts, and who has recently been accused of rape. I should add that all of the content for the questions were gathered by publicly available information. So we really wanted to get these games out into the public, but to also strategically get them distributed to the delegates. So we tried volunteering to the CHOGM volunteer program with no joy, and then discovered that the Queen was holding a public birthday barbecue as part of the festivities, where members of the public as well as delegates were invited. So we thought this was perfect, and it gave us the opportunity to distribute our game. And then as an added challenge, we set ourselves the ultimate goal of hand-delivering a pack to the Queen.
Wow.
Yeah. So that was the plan. But before we got to that point, we had to deal with internal conversations about possible arrests and fines, took our board out of resigning, and we have a really fantastic, courageous, hands-on board, and when they get nervous, we get nervous. We had to strategise with how to deal with our government funding agencies and find a way to protect anyone who was handed a card pack by us from getting into trouble. So some of the strategies we put in place were thanks to having a great lawyer on our board who was able to help negotiate the possible litigation aspects of the work. We got board insurance, we wrote out a disclaimer which sat at the back of the card pack. We double-checked our constitution to make sure no one was financially liable. We also put 2 warnings, which I think I've got here, on the pack of cards to cover ourselves and potential players. And then we rather cheekily released our media statement to relevant funding bodies the day before the Queen's barbecue on a Friday at 5:30 p.m. hoping that by that time everybody would have already gone home, so it would sit unread in people's inboxes over the weekend, and by the time it was opened on Monday, the work would have already taken place. But what we couldn't quite resolve was this growing sense of fear and panic around what might happen to us as a result of doing this. And it prompted all kinds of paranoid discussions about what do we do if our funding is stripped from us, if we have to go to jail, what are the likely charges, will our kids be okay, is this the right battle to be fighting, should we be choosing our battles more carefully, has anyone ever been tasered, should we warn other studio artists about potential raids on the CIA building? And it's funny looking back at it now, how paranoid we became. But at the time, it felt very real. And I think that discussion was necessary, as it did to some extent make us quite vigilant about what we were doing, really informed about the situation, and super prepared for worst case scenarios. But it was this classic case of internalising the fear and coming to the point of self-censoring. So I'm just going to show here. As you can see from these images, we did go ahead and infiltrated the barbecue. We managed to target a couple of delegates. We even got the Lord Mayor of Perth, who politely posed for a photo opportunity after being handed a set of cards. I think we've got a shot of that. Lovely Lisa Scafidi there saying thanks very much. We missed the Queen, unfortunately. We did try, but ended up handing over a set to her security detail. And after 3 or so hours on the ground and 54 cards distributed later, we were in the nearest pub, drinking heavily and waiting for the phone to ring, which it didn't. And we did have to have a frank discussion with some of our funding partners who mostly were quite congratulatory. And a few days later, we actually got a very curious email from the then Federal Arts Minister, Simon Crean. Oh, there's me waiting for the Queen. There she goes. And she's gone. And this was the email. I'll just quickly read it. So, blah, blah, blah. Thank you for your email. The Australian Government acknowledges the important role independent artistic organisations such as PVI Collective play in encouraging social engagement and the participation of Australians in arts activity. Through experimenting with new interdisciplinary art forms, groups such as yours help support innovation in young artists and creative development. Thank you for drawing the Minister's attention to your latest game. So I have to admit, we were really confused by this. Had the work been a success? Had we failed miserably? What had been the impact? And did, in fact, the Federal Arts Minister actually have a sense of humour? I wonder if we could say the same for Brandis. I don't really know the answer to that, but what I do feel very strongly about is the power of art to open up a space to ask questions. They may be difficult, unpopular questions that some people would rather were left alone, but you take away our right and ability to do that, then, well, I guess that is censorship in my book. Thank you.
Okay, so who am I? I am the crazy lady known as Lady Bananas. I do lots of stuff and things all around the place. I don't like to prepare speeches. I like to just go all in and give you an insight into my creative brain and how it expresses itself. The best way I can do this is by showing an intro into what I do. So my specialist kind of field is working with youth. I aim to light little seeds of imagination in little souls and get them on positive paths of engagement with urban art, which is graffiti art as you know it in the vandalism world, but we're trying to make it positive and part of the community around us. So I work all around the local governments and different youth groups, at-risk kids and DCP, and we try and kind of, I guess, make people happy, make them smile and try something new. And with a spray can, you can express yourself in so many different ways, and that's what we bring to the world. I also do a lot of girls' graffiti groups, which I think is really important to encourage females to express themselves from an early age into a often, I guess, male-dominated area of art. Also working a lot in Indigenous arts in rural communities like Narrabeen. We also do screen printing programs and art design programs and try and integrate all of that into our workshops. So we really give kids an overall showcase, I guess, of how you can apply yourself in the different art forms, not just in graffiti art. It goes across into screen printing, it goes into illustration, it goes into graphic art, and it can be a creative art, which is really important for people to realise. I'm also a bit of a weirdo, and I like to recycle and reuse what I create. So it's also a really good way of relieving stress if you're confined with too much, I guess, government policies, is to bash spray cans with a hammer and then look at the forms that you create and see what you can express on the spray can. So I look at the spray can once I've bashed it, and I look at the shapes it folds, and then I paint pictures that I see into the artwork. Now, I've been doing this with kids all around Perth, and it's a really good tool for them to look at expressing themselves into I guess, a mangled piece of metal, and kind of looking at things in a different way, not saying come up with a design and stick it on something and be regimented in the way you go about it. It's more about breaking those boundaries and I guess allowing them to create in a different way. Last year we started a graffiti art collective in Fremantle called Artists Anonymous. The premise is bringing graffiti artists together in a professional format to showcase what we do and activate walls in our area and present public art in a professional way. Interesting enough, through the art and kind of youth work that we do, we found problems that graffiti artists that are working illegally in the field have come to us as a sort of semi-formal advocacy kind of platform. So when they have problems, instead of them harassing all the people and getting really emotionally engaged and sometimes even quite violently attached to their artwork, they come to us with their problems and then we put them forward to the appropriate channels for advice or help or litigation or law advice, which has been a really positive kind of new approach, and it allows them a voice that represents them independently but also without the sense of formality, I guess, which is really important. There's me being fancy in Scoop magazine. This was important because it was showcasing how businesses are looking at street art to promote themselves and to engage different people from around the world to come and visit their premises. So this article is looking at what Perth companies or businesses or private houses even are doing to engage public art and embrace it, which is a really good thing overall. A recent one for us was a house on Ray Ave in Fremantle. Their wall kept getting repeatedly tagged, and we worked with them to come up with an awesome mural to prevent tagging, and that's been up for a year and it hasn't been vandalised since. It didn't need a graffiti-proof coating. It's brought people to the area. There's been photo shoots in front of it. The family have people dropping by every weekend, knocking on their door going, who did this? It's amazing. Like, how do we get something like this on our houses, or how do we be involved with public art? And I think that's a really important community change, is the aspect of people's perspective, not looking at it as vandalism and looking at it in a different way, and kind of wanting it on their homes, wanting it on their businesses. I don't really want it in advertising, but let's not go there. It's a good tool across a lot of platforms for a lot of people. This is a warehouse where we're based for Artists Anonymous Collective. It's the Fremantle Fibonacci Centre. It's a really good incubator space for people to come in and showcase what they want to do and change the space around. So for this, we did Sculptures on the Street exhibition last year, which had over 70 artists involved. We did sculptures scattered all around the streets of Blencoe Street, Wood Street and Knutsford Street. And we had installations in various warehouses. We also did wraparound murals, and it was the first kind of public art adventure tour for the City of Fremantle, and from what I know, in the City of Perth as well. And this was all independently done through artists and DIY hard work. So it just shows you kind of what you can do with a lot of blood, sweat and tears and passion. Other things that I'm really kind of geekily interested in is light graffiti and pushing the boundaries of, I guess, space, time, capturing elements of colour and light and how you can interact with them. I created a light graffiti invention in 2009. There was an electronic spray can which was a hack for Nokia. So we hacked the N900 phone and we created an app. We created an electronic spray can which connected to the phone, and you was able to take light graffiti photographs in real time and paint with the spray can, which was huge. So we went to the UK, we did an awesome exhibition at Victoria Albert, and it was a really good success. And it was a good cross-platform tool to see how we could push the boundaries. And when it comes to, I guess, murals in Perth and laws and guidelines and art history and historical precedents, there was an important issue that came up 2 weeks ago, which was Perth City Farm was about to be repainted over with a new mural. And this particular wall, which is featured down the bottom, was done by 3DB Crew. And this was the first legal production they did, and they initiated with City Farm. Now this was about to be repainted over, and one of the issues for the artists that were involved in this was that Jared Axups had passed away 3 months ago. And this wall had a lot of, I guess, emotional attachment to the community, and it was about to be painted over without consultation. So Artists Anonymous were asked to advocate for this wall and for the community and try and prevent the mural from being painted over. This led me to digging deeper and kind of going into, well, why aren't there guidelines in place for historical graffiti, and is there documentation for historical graffiti, and how can we shape this and not kind of, I guess, take away that expression and protect it, but also allow it to change. So we weren't saying don't paint over the mural, we were just saying have community consultation first and allow there to be kind of a free-flowing process instead of just paint over it, start again, paint over it, start again. And we managed to stop it, which was really awesome, and City Farm were really, welcoming of setting up some new guidelines. City of Perth were quite reasonable at working alongside us to produce a publication on some of Perth's history. City Farm has been a place, almost like a home for graffiti artists over the last 20 years in Perth, and is one of the most prominent first legal spots for artists of any kind of career path, whether you're a tagger, just starting out, or a professional artist, you could go and do a mural. So this is why we felt this site had a lot of, importance to save, and I think it is important to continue to protect things like this, and there needs to be some kind of, not regimented laws, but guidelines in place to do this. So that's what we're working towards. We're also really passionate about being aligned with the right kind of politics, and one of the important issues at the moment is the amalgamations with local government. So artists and owners have joined, Fremantle Council's fight against Columbine's plan to merge everyone into inconvenient little packages. So we've developed street art campaigns to go alongside, but independently, with this campaign, and test the boundaries of public's reaction to amalgamations, to public art, to just general social issues in general, and start to kind of engage the community a little bit better. So we'll see how we go with that. Merging councils will be an interesting battle. So this is the wall that I was talking about before with the families in Rayav, just so you get a nice little visual. My email's on there and mobile. If anyone wants to contact me in any kind of creative, pick your brain discussion, you're more than welcome to. I love to rant with people about different issues they face and how we can make Perth a better place and how we can express ourselves continually despite the obstacles we face. And I'm like a positive little reminder that you can cut through red tape, achieve kind of big things and make stuff happen if you're willing to kick enough shins. And I'm really appreciative that people respond to that, and I think it's a really good thing. So I'm going to hand you over to all the experts now, and they can give you all the backup advice that we need to move forward and continue to create good things. Thank you.
So I think one of the interesting comments that you made, Kelly, was that CHOGM was a juicy opportunity. Well, I think we have a juicy opportunity right now to talk about particularly interesting topics around this idea of art, in the public realm, and whether or not it's inherently political, because of course a lot of the things that you were saying is that very clearly you were immediately placed into a political situation. Whatever you were doing was seen as political, and the ramifications were quite serious. So maybe we can start with you. You clearly had that as an intention, that you want it to be a political statement. It's an intervention.
Yeah, and I think for us we were always kind of, think about, it's not really about gauging the success of a work, but for us it's more interesting to have, to not have, an arts review in the arts section, but actually for it to move beyond the arts section and be somewhere else. For us that's kind of a terrific response. So, I think using the CHOGM example, clearly we were kind of skating on thin ice, and there was just this idea of unknown what was going to happen. But I do think that what does worry me is that kind of fear of the unknown, what it can do to you, and how it can actually really affect you personally. And as a group, I think we're quite lucky that we operate as a collective, because when one of us is kind of maybe having a paranoid moment, there are some other sensible people in the room that can help counterbalance it. Whereas I think if you were on your own, it might be kind of hugely daunting. So
tinfoil hat stuff.
Yeah.
But clearly you're also talking about finding the battle, picking the battle.
Yeah.
This was one that you thought was worth really going for.
We did, and I think it was a really interesting debate that we had alongside our board about kind of, there's been a couple of times in PVI Collective's career where we've had to ask that question, is this going to be the last piece of work we make, and do we want, if we're going to go down with this one, are we going to be proud of it? And so in a way what it inadvertently does is it makes you go, really full help towards it, to making sure that, you strategized it properly. It is so well planned. It was like a military operation, so it actually, it forced us into that kind of, not that we ever want to make sloppy work, but we were so kind of like prepared in every aspect. And I think it did that for us, and we needed kind of, in a way, we needed that to kind of help us kind of go a little bit further. So, that has happened other times as well. And I think that's, all credit to the other members of the group. We do have families, and we have houses, and we have bills to pay, and those questions come up a lot, and how is this going to affect me personally? And I think that's a completely fair question to be asking.
You
so,
bet.
Yeah.
Now, interesting, you were talking about your lawyer, and
Yes.
Robin turned to me and said, "I want to know who that lawyer is." But this must happen when you have groups come to you and say, "We want to work in the public realm." It is inherently a political statement that we're going to be making. What sort of laws are we likely to be breaching?
Yeah, and that will depend on the sort of work that's being made. And so prior to us starting this evening, I was having that conversation with Kelly and saying, well, she's obviously, you said you weren't an expert, but these guys are experts. In fact, they've worked through a whole lot of different laws that apply to the art making and the creative work that you're making. And I was thinking it would be a really great outcome of this sort of session to actually harness some of that knowledge that they've got, because we've put together, for example, information sheets for filmmakers and about all the different permits they need to get, but we at Arts Law haven't actually put together an information sheet for performance artists who are working in the public space and are having to navigate their series of laws. So each, it would be really good to actually put together a package, sort of bringing your expertise and making that available to other people, because what our lawyers would do at Arts Law, you'd ring up and ask for the advice, and we go, all right, what are you doing? And we sort of try and work through all the scenarios to see which are the relevant laws that are going to apply in that particular situation. And it isn't ever a one-size-fits-all. It's going to depend on the situation. So what is relevant to graffiti artists and your fabulous new graffiti laws in Western Australia, the Tough on Graffiti strategy.
Fremantle only. We're trying to get every other city to adopt our guidelines, but we'll see how we go.
Yeah, no, but I'm sort of being facetious about the fact that you're tackling these graffiti laws that have been put in place here in Western Australia, because they're not the same necessarily in every other state of Australia. So that's a very because it isn't a one-size-fits-all, and we just work through the issues. And for example, the case that Tamara mentioned with the Melbourne artist who's been charged with a child pornography offence, that is another area where the boundaries are really going to be tested. He's been charged, so presumably it's going to go to hearing. And I was just spent some time recently in Europe, and I'm looking at all the galleries and all the work where you've got children in art, and I'm thinking, well, we're in a really different space now in Australia, where it's almost like a no-go zone because of the potential for this sort of thing to happen. And obviously there are child advocates that they've got their reasons why they're pursuing this line, but on the other hand you've got a whole lot of artists who are being labelled as child pornographers in a way that is quite bizarre, really, when you look at what those laws are intended for.
It's interesting, isn't it? The three of us, in effect, were involved with that Bill Henson case in one way or another. I was on the Strata Council. We were required to put some legislation together, and Tamara was involved, and Robin. But Bill Henson, of course, never intended that. That was a consequence of showing the work and putting out that invitation. He wasn't actually pushing at the boundaries, whereas PVI and Lady Bananas, you're both pushing at the boundaries. You want to find out what the boundary is. So, there is really an incentive there for you to sort of find what the limit is. And in that case, that's where the law actually is becoming quite difficult, because often what happens is the reaction is much worse than you'd ever expected. Like these graffiti laws, you know, why are they worse in Western Australia? Probably because you've been very effective.
Yeah. There also was an interesting one, sorry. In 2003, the Sydney Opera House got painted by protesters who wrote "No War" on it, and they got detention time and 150,000 fine as well. How does that relate now? Have the changes like the laws changed now? Is there any lesser penalty for that kind of thing that you're working?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Nothing that's changed that's come to my attention. I can't say that sort of, but
So
there's no.
How does the public, when they do have a political slogan, whether they're into art or not, how do they express themselves without huge detriment to their personal well-being?
I suppose that act is a fairly. I mean, I can see both sides of it. I'm not saying that the artist should have been punished in that way, but I just always come, I suppose, from the lawyer's perspective, and we're on the side of the artist, so we try and give them the advice that they need. So if they come to us beforehand, which they probably didn't, we would say, well, this is the potential consequences of doing this, and really then you have to make a decision whether you're going to go down that path or not. But it was interesting with the example you put up, which I thought was fabulous, doing the work to protect the work at City Farm.
Yeah.
And it did raise a question for me, well, those artists actually do have moral rights. And so, if those artists had come to us, well, we would say, actually, you do have some rights around this work, and there's some sort of steps that have to be worked through before the work is removed.
Yeah.
Which
is what we're trying to create with the venues and the councils, so that's a bit of communication, because at the moment there's gaps, and information is falling through the gaps, and that's what we see time and time again. And these are the problems, all these people don't have cohesive information. And I guess that's our job as artists, is to try and nut out these little holes and go, well, this is what's missing, this is what we need, how can we make this better? And try and work together, and that's what we're pushing for.
Which sort of raises the issue of where these hierarchies of power, who controls the space. Tamara, you must be aware, perhaps more than all of us, where those hierarchies lie.
Oh, yes. Well, in a way, power is, it's a funny thing, because there's kind of moral power as well as legal power. And sometimes, as in Kelly, in both of your cases, I think they demonstrate the fact that by using humour and by using wit and cunning, you actually claim the high ground. So there is a power in artistry, that art has expressive power and power to trigger ideas in people that actually defy the sort of punitive nature of certain laws, and they can make them look ridiculous. I mean, your story was such a wonderful story. I just wish I'd been there, a fly on the wall, watching all these, frantic manoeuvrings to get, to make your point. But I think that there is, it is a contested zone, and we have to acknowledge the fact that people like Lady Bananas and the PVI Collective are taking really genuine risks for all of us. So it's not just to create a successful project, but as both of you, I think, have demonstrated, you're actually stretching, the parameters so that other people can also claim that ground. And you're asking very important questions, because often what we find is that when regulations are brought into play or put in place, they're often done because of fear that something terrible, something is at stake, that public morality is at stake, or the well-being of particular or the sensibilities of particular groups of people are at stake, and pushing to say, well, why is that? Can't independent, clear-thinking adults be allowed to make up their minds for themselves? Do we actually have to be as much of a nanny state as is implied by some of the laws? Or on the other hand, are there protections that are absolutely essential because of vulnerabilities? So, you know, to flip to the other side, the ground is being contested, sometimes for the best motives on both sides. So, you know, children are particularly vulnerable, but there are also things like racial vilification. So, for example, what I have heard is that George Brandis, the new arts minister, has said that he's going to have a look at at getting rid of the racial vilification laws, because he positions himself as an advocate for freedom of expression. He's apparently saying, well, surely we should be able to put up with a bit of, you know, argy-bargy. We should be able to say certain things about one another without feeling that we have to be so politically correct. So it is, you know, it's a contest, and I love the idea that you didn't talk about, Kelly, but one of the things that I know PVI Collective does as a mechanism for testing this is the tug of war, because it is a tug of war, and each side has its strengths and weaknesses, you know, so the contested ground of, you know, who has the power, it will, I guess, depend on what's at stake.
But I think what it also does is it points out to us, as Kelly, you were outlining the laws. Now, I live here. I lived through CHOGM. I wasn't aware that we were living in quite such a police state.
And I think that's the surprising thing with a lot of the time when we're making work, is that there is this assumption from people of like, well, what's the big deal? You know, what's the problem? And that really have no idea the kind of
nightmares.
Well, the logistical nightmares and the permits and the public liability certificates and all of that paraphernalia are things that, you know, we have to go through, a part of the processes we have to go through before we even open at work, you know. So, and it's huge. You know, one of the funniest fines we've ever gotten was in Glasgow. We were making a work called Deviator, which is this iPhone app, and you transform the city into a playground. And there were lots of on-site performers. We had permits coming out of our ears. You know, we thought we had the whole thing nailed down. One performer was playing this game called Street Golf, where he initially had his task for the duration of the show was really to just try to find bits of rubbish and use a golf club to hit the rubbish into the bins. That was his task. He got stopped by the police, and the golf club was confiscated because it was seen as a potential weapon. So we thought, okay, what can we use instead? So we took an umbrella, turned it upside down, used that instead, and we got a fine for £50, which literally said, for hitting a piece of rubbish with an umbrella from one area to another. Because apparently
There's a law for
there's
you.
a law. Like, it's insane. It was like just the insanity of it, you know.
There's no bounds to human imagination.
I know. We were so stunned. It was, you know. Yeah.
Note that one down, Robin.
It sounds like it was overseas.
But it reminds me that you know, the law can change quite rapidly depending on circumstances. And you know, what you described was new laws that were brought into play, particularly for that event.
Yeah.
But they can hang around.
Yeah.
And you know, I remember Joe Bjelke-Petersen bringing in laws to prevent public assembly, which were really draconian. You know, that meant that no more than 3 people could meet together in a public place without being regarded as being criminals, you know, breaking the law. And you have to think, well, where's that going to lead? You know, and certainly during the you know, post 9/11, the kind of terrorism legislation that was brought into Australia was pretty draconian, and some of it's still hanging around. You probably know better than me.
And it brought back some of those. That actually applies in Perth still, the gatherings of 3 or more people.
Yeah.
One of the things that came out of the Bill Henson case, which I remember you telling me about at the time, Robin, was that if that had have happened in another state, it wouldn't. Bill Henson, working in Melbourne, with a girl of a certain age was against the law. But if he had been doing it in Sydney, it wasn't against the law. If he had been doing it in Brisbane, there was a no fine. It was every single, if you just crossed state borders, everything was different.
Yeah, and that's what's difficult. Even looking at this current case involving Paul Ure in Melbourne, you know what the laws are in Victoria dealing with child pornography are different to the laws in other states. So there are some defences that are available to him there that aren't available to him in other places. But in another state, there might be more defences available to him in relation to artistic merit. So yes, I mean that's the beast that the legal system is in Australia. That it's both. We have a system of both federal and state laws, and so you know it's about and having to navigate. And if someone's got a national artistic practice or you've got an international practice, then it becomes even more complicated because you've got to get your head around what's the situation in, say, that sounded like a UK example, compared to the situation here in Perth. Yeah. So that's just the nature of what we've got to deal with.
One of the things that you said, Kelly, I thought was really interesting, that you tend to self-censor in certain situations. Can you talk about that a bit more? Because I think that's a really interesting aspect of this whole discussion around free expression.
I think it's something that we're really conscious of, actually, and and I think after, you know, I think we're in our 15th year now, and we have been through situations. I will talk about just for you mentioning the anti-terror laws, that we made a work called Terrorist Training School that was made in 1998. It was commissioned by the then Outrage Festival, and all of our publicity had gone out. It was a sightseeing terror bus tour of the city, an alternative sightseeing terror tour, where we would take people to various iconic hotspots. And there would be these tour guides, and the audiences were on the bus. We would get off at these various locations, and there would be a lot of talk around ways in which, you know, this space could possibly be disrupted. But it was quite vague, you know, very kind of colourful but quite angry work. All of our publicity had gone out. We were 8 days away from opening the show, and the Bali bombings happened. And we found ourselves in a really horrendous situation where, you know, there was a lot of ministerial pressure to pull the work. The festival that supported us lost one of their major funders. They were having to deal with phone calls from relatives of Bali bombing victims. We had threats. Some of us had to move houses to make sure our children were safe. It was really incredibly full on. I think that experience for us had a really, really profound effect, where we really were made to feel like we were bad people. And you know, the work itself was actually quite humorous and quite in typical fashion. You know, it was using humour, but in light of, you know, what had happened, obviously it just completely wasn't seen that way at all. And so we had to fight that battle, and we did withdraw the work, and we put it on again at a later time, and then we toured it nationally around Australia. And we really had to get our shit together and kind of decide, you know, really, we're going to fight for this work. We believe what we're doing is right. We realise there is a conversation to be had here about this idea of, you know, being in fear of terrorism, the anti-terror legislation that's coming up, and, you know, it being quite draconian. We really felt there was a point to make, and we were going to stand by the work and carry on, and we did it, and we were really glad. But I think that's always still sits in the back of our minds now. So I don't know if that quite answers your question.
No, it doesn't. Lady Bananas, are you in that situation? Do you find self-censorship coming in just as a way of, as a sort of protective device?
It was funny, as I was hearing Kelly talk, I was like, this reminds me of the project that I was talking about with the light graffiti. The problem, sorry, allergies are going off lately. The problem we had with creating that device was similar to what you faced, is that exporting our creative device to London, we were targeted as terrorists because we were carrying 6 prototypes of electronic spray cans in our luggage that had Bluetooth remotes and applications to track and GPS record your movement in time-space. So we actually faced a whole bunch of problems on that and were labelled quite harshly as we went through customs. However, the power of Lady Bananas is that I'm able to shape people's minds into understanding. So we actually got the product into the UK through all of the 6 different various security hotspots. The problem we faced was we wanted to bring the exhibition to Australia. Now, the irony was that we were able to get it over to the UK, we were able to exhibit it in Melbourne as well, but bringing it back to our own country, it was destroyed by UPS as a bomb threat.
Wow.
So we actually lost our prototype and our invention, which took almost 2 years to create. And so we could actually never recreate that because the data was lost and it was a prototype. So that was a really kind of significant wake-up call for me in terms of, you know, exporting your art and then bringing it back and trying to showcase it to the Australian public and how things are looked at in law and how my device that I'd put all this time and energy and love into was looked at like as a potential harm to people, and I was just overwhelmed with like, how could that be such a conflict? Like, I've got the documentation, I've got the paperwork, I've got the permits, I've got the approval, yet your mind is telling you that this is a bomb. How do I change that perspective? And I just couldn't with UPS, so I lost that battle. But there's heaps of little problems that we face in that realm, is kind of understanding whether it's a privatised law or whether it's a government law or whether it's a community law or, you know, where do we fit in those boundaries? And you only face that when you tackle it.
Yeah.
So
So
you just have to keep digging the grave.
what would you do differently now?
I probably wouldn't use UPS. I don't know. There is so much, I guess, fear that's associated with art and expression, and that is why we try and test the boundaries and push people's fear a little bit and do it with a sense of humour. A similar thing that we've done in Fremantle is when the council applied this new, I guess, acceptance of art can stay policy in relation to graffiti art. So if it was a tag, it will be removed. If it has artistic merit, it will be allowed to stay, with appropriate consultation between who owns the property and all that kind of stuff. There was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek game that Artists Anonymous played with the council when this law first came in place, because we saw that there was holes in this area. And there was a wall that was painted, and then the artwork was removed overnight by buff contractors, and under the new policy it was meant to go through consultation processes, which is the aim of this new policy, is to embrace these forms of expression, allow people to have expression, and then also create consultation about the law. So the artwork that was created anonymously overnight was taken down, and it was a picture of a businessman with a suitcase, and he was holding the world, and it said, "We own you." Now that was taken down almost immediately, but the new policy stated if it had artistic merit or a political tongue-in-cheek kind of tone, it would be allowed to stay, because that has kind of social and cultural integrity in our community. And we saw that as a big problem with the new policy, and we're like, why did this get removed? And me being the little private investigator that I am, I dig into little holes and I find out information, and I found out that it was actually illegitimate behaviour on the contractors. So they actually removed the graffiti, labelled it as vandalism, and didn't report it to the appropriate levels for consultation and, you know, all the positive things we're trying to do. So overnight, this next artwork appeared, and it was a challenge for the community, for the police, for the graffiti task force, and for the contractors. And I actually forgot to show you in the presentation, and I should actually bring it up just because it's quite tongue-in-cheek and it changed the law and it set a standard for communication. So I'll show it to you and you can see for yourself. So it actually got featured in the West Australian as well the next day, which was kind of huge. And it was the first kind of illegal mural to be preserved by the City of Fremantle. And it was a picture depicting Little Red Riding Hood, who had painted a graffiti piece, so you can't see it. That's good. Cool. So that's the artwork there. I can't get a bigger photo of it. But basically it was a picture of Little Red Riding Hood painting a beautiful community-spirited mural with rainbows and trees and treeness. And then the big bad wolf has come along and painted over it. And the message is, I'm just doing my job, which is removing community spirit, artwork, and beauty around us. Now, this one actually created a lot of stir, and we thought that even though it was done anonymously, we may face quite heavy law, and the council actually worked with us and were quite supportive in keeping it because of its social message and its tongue-in-cheek approach. And we also exposed the holes in the system for them to actually clarify and change. And that was really important. And, it was kind of setting the boundary, but also pushing the boundary and going, well, you want to change things, but you've got to keep testing to see if it's working. And that's kind of where we see our main base of work being.
It's a bit of a trick though when you call yourself the Anonymous Artist Group and then say it was done anonymously. It's a bit of a dead giveaway, really.
Well, I didn't do it. It was a team of anonymous artists.
But of course.
Yeah.
But of course.
Yeah.
But look, what I'd like to do now is just to open it up to the floor, because I know that there's a lot of people out there who have very interesting situations and have been in, some of you anyway, I know, in very similar situations where you've actually had to contest the space in which your art has been shown. So does anybody have any questions or any comments? Yes.
I have a question for Robin. I'm just thinking about the Paul Yor, Bill Henson situations. I'm wondering, when you're talking about how there are different laws in different states, I'm wondering whether where the work was made and where the work was exhibited, if those laws pertain to either of those situations specifically, like whether creating the work, say, like Paul Yor's recent work, whether creating it is the crime or whether exhibiting it is the crime, and if they're in different states, how that works.
Good question.
Yeah, it is a good question because actually in the case of Bill Henson, when he was working with children, that the actual act of creation and using kids, like photographing children in his, making his art, that was about where he was creating the work, because each state has different laws about working with children. And then where it's exhibited, that's where the difference would be about are you publishing child pornography, for example. So that would then affect... so actually child pornography is interesting because it's about producing and possessing and exhibiting. So it could actually cover different boundaries. So it could be, if you made the work in Victoria, then there could be charges relating to both producing and the child employment laws. And then if he exhibits it in New South Wales, then there will be different laws there in relation to child pornography. And then on top of all of that, there's a federal layer, because that's our classification system, is federal-based laws. So it goes to, and part of the answer, well, it's not actually, it's a defence really to these sorts of charges, is then to have the work classified by the classification board, which is what happened in Bill Henson's case. When the classification board classified it, they gave it a PG rating. So really, once the classification board had given it a PG rating, it's, the police weren't then going to pursue the child pornography charges because it was a joke. And they've actually changed the law now in New South Wales so that if you, and it's the same in Victoria too, so if you have the work classified and it gets a classification which is less than a refused classification or X18 plus, then that's a complete defence to both producing and possessing child pornography. So, yeah, but I'm not sure exactly what the situation is in Western Australia, because I haven't had a close look at that. But that's, you see, it's very complex, and that's just one example in that particular sphere of children and working with children and the child pornography laws. And then, the area that you're working in, there's a whole nother sort of network and complex list of laws that you have to work through to make sure.
But I think that's fascinating. Like, where does the actual illegal activity or action, where does it happen? Like, where? Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in that in the case of Paul Yor, because from what I've read, it seems as though the issue isn't that actual children were involved in indecent acts, the artwork is a collage, visual collage, that portrays a child, but it doesn't. Anyway, so there's no act of indecency. It's
Actually,
visual content, which is confusing.
I was just thinking, sorry, in response to what you were saying, I had a conversation with the police in, where was I? Anyway, not a state, can't remember where I was. And I asked them the question about whether there was any research that demonstrated that people might be changed by being exposed to things that were dodgy, that were on the edge. And he said that it wasn't so much that that there was research that showed that people changed in response to being exposed to, say, child pornography, but it was more what they were equally concerned about was that it sort of normalised things that were unacceptable. So, for example, in being able to make that work available freely and often, the idea is that people's sensibilities and protective instincts get blunted, or that their behaviour changes because in constant exposure it means that it somehow has legitimacy, and so that's another issue really that we have to think about in terms of where the public good lies, whether we think that it's okay, for example, for children to be sexualised in advertising. It's a really big question about whether in little kids being used for advertising purposes and being dressed up and made up and so on as if they're adults and behaving provocatively, whether that isn't not only causing them harm but also causing harm publicly, in that being normalised as an okay thing to do. So it's yet another area of tension, I think.
I found that I just saw it the other night, the Vodafone ad with the adult bodies with children, babies' heads. I found that quite confronting, and I wondered how that got through onto, I guess, mainstream television, with, say, kids' heads being on adult bodies in nightclubs as a selling point for Vodafone. I found that personally quite confronting.
Well, that's very close to the Paul Ure scenario.
Yeah, and it reminded me of that. And I saw it and I was like, well, how does a big corporation like Vodafone get this bizarre advertising tactic through that no one really understands or sympathises with or connects with personally, except that maybe they're trying to rip off the dancing baby hype. But it really just struck me as so unusual and quite a bizarre juxtaposition, I guess, of advertising and use of babies' faces in adult formats and what that presents as a society, and also what that means. Like, are we now saying that it's not the preteens, it's now baby adults? Like, you have to be an adult from a baby now? I don't know. This is the questions that it posed to me, and I thought, this all relates. Like, how we view things and what is accepted. Right.
I did note that you said you would never allow your work to be involved in advertising. Why is that? Do you see advertising as being the sort of nemesis of creative practice?
It's not so much never used in advertising, it's more the appropriate choices. So I'm quite gung-ho on having a moral responsibility of your creative channels and the pathways you go down to create revenue. And I personally find that you have to associate yourself with the right particular moral business or the right advertising company if you want to work with them. And I think often people just chase the carrot, I guess, in terms of like donkey and carrot game, and they'll just do the work without actually thinking about the moral responsibility of the company or advertising client that they're working for.
So can I ask then, if you have painted a store that you're comfortable with, and then the ownership changes and they choose to stick with that kind of interior, how would you respond if you weren't happy?
Well, this has actually just come up in a wall where Soto Cafe was. So another member of our collective painted a mural and it was removed. And there was quite an uproar about that because the business changed and it didn't suit the business's aims. But the community felt that it shouldn't be removed. And the community actually actively engaged the council to try and stop it from being removed. However, the business owner chose to remove it and paint it back to white. Now, this was an interesting thing. For me personally, I would find, you know, if it's done commercially without a real creative-driven thing, if it's for a business and the business changes, they do have the right as a commercial business to do whatever the hell they like. However, if you're based in a community and you're working with public and you want the public to be, I guess, engaged in what you do as a new business, then I would suggest that you try and include all aspects in consultation. And it relates to City Farm exactly. Like, if you're going to remove something and people are attached to it, people are going to react in different ways, and you can't gauge how everyone's going to react. I'll react in a really quite clear and formal and friendly approach. However, another graffiti artist might not. They might kick in your windows and tag your wall again. It's a really different thing. So it depends on who you engage, what you're asking for, and what you're changing at the same time if you do go to change your business or mural.
I think that comes back to your point, Tamara, as well, about it crossing that line between it being public and private.
Yeah.
Which is really fascinating, isn't it? Like, who
Well,
does
I
it belong
don't
to?
know that we really have dealt with the visual space, you know, and because of you know, the question of ownership. The question of ownership is kind of really about physical land, but when it becomes part of the public domain, as in the case you're describing, where even though it doesn't physically belong to the community, it does visually belong to the community, then a whole different set of rights seems to be in question. And I mean, the other side of the story, the other question that it raises for me is that, you know, what should prevail where, say, some in the community love it because it's become part of their history, but, you know, shouldn't we also embrace change is the other question that's asked. You know, do we have to hang on to things just because they're there? You know, because they've been there for 30 years or 50 years or 15 or however long, does it mean that we have to keep protecting them? So there's another question about, you know, public resistance to the new, which is, a whole other challenge.
Yes.
Can I ask what your problem is that you're facing personally? What is the problem that you're facing personally? Do you have a wall that needs to be painted over, or?
No.
Yeah.
No, I was wondering where you sat.
Yeah.
On the issue of, so you said you paint for a business that you feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
If that business changed and chose to keep your artwork, and you didn't like the business.
Oh, that's an interesting.
Okay, so I missed that key point.
That
Okay.
was my question.
Sorry, yeah, that's why I wanted to clarify and come back to it, because I wasn't sure if that was the thing. I mean,
you know, because in one sense you're giving over control to a commercial entity, even if it's one you feel good about.
Yeah, that's a hard question. I don't know. It depends on the business, I guess. I guess if it was an adult store, I'd probably be a bit concerned because my name's Lady Bananas. But like, other than that, you know, I'd have to look at what business it was, and if I wouldn't necessarily say no to it. There's no way like I'd go and paint their wall white and say, no, you can't have my creative goodness, because I like to be inclusive. You know, it's just that I choose who I align with if they're engaging me in the work that I actively do. So that's, I guess, the difference.
There was a question at the back.
I was just actually going to have a legal, because I just
go.
I was sort of, while you were asking the question, I was sort of thinking, oh, okay, so what, I think there will be a moral rights issue. I mean, there's a moral rights issue in this about your right, and moral rights isn't just about being attributed, it's about the way the work is exhibited. And so there potentially is a moral rights argument if you really hated the way the work was now being exhibited. And the other, of course, is the in that sort of private sphere, having a contractual relationship in place. So if you've been contracted to do something for a particular business and you wanted to have some sort of right over what happened if that business changed hands, then I'd be looking as a lawyer, how do I work that in to the agreement with the business so that you had that ongoing rights over the work, whether it stayed or whether it went. That's just, just sort of, and I'd have to work
It's
through
very
that.
interesting. It's a good question.
It's a really good
It was
question.
a really good
because,
question.
because your reputation, if say
Yeah.
the business changed to become something that you were really ideologically opposed to,
Yeah.
then your reputation stands to be damaged by
It also depends
So
on the context of the artwork. Like I said, if someone's commercially engaging you to do an artwork, you know, you're creating it for them, so the creative purpose is different. Or if someone's painting you and they say, I love your art, I just want you to go nuts on my wall, that's your own creation. So that's where you kind of are more personally attached to it. If you're doing it for a corporation or a company, you're giving part of what you do, but also, I guess, pleasing part of what they need. So it's a really interesting line.
There was a question at the back, and I know, Paolo, you had one.
Yeah, that's me. Hi.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say about wall activations. You were saying, I just think it's lazy of artists to want to repaint the same thing over and over again, and there's plenty of walls and plenty of people who, with open arms, will embrace artists and all sorts of...
Yeah, so the problem with the availability of legal walls is that they're not activated necessarily in a timely manner, and this is what is frustrating for a lot of artists working in the public sector, is that you approach a business or you approach the council with a mural that you wish to do, and you have to apply for permits just like Kelly does, and you have to go through the process of applying, giving conceptual designs, and then waiting for approval. And there's a really long time that goes between the paperwork being submitted and it going through all the different departments for the boxes to be checked. This is kind of also important why the City of Fremantle is important to us, because working alongside with them, we've helped develop new guidelines so that if you actively wish to express yourself on a wall as an individual or an artist group, you can apply to the City of Fremantle with a mural application, and you can get it approved now within 7 days. And that's if you want to initiate it yourself, DIY, pay for it yourself, and express what you want with no, I guess, conceptual boundaries other than it can't be abusive, which is kind of allowing for more walls, not less. And that's also why we're trying to fight the City Farm thing, is because we're trying to say that there should be more art around us, not stuff being repainted over continually. And the reason the stuff gets painted over is because there is such a long time frame for things to get through. So people go to the places where they can activate things easily and just try and repaint over it. And it kind of goes back to what you were saying before, like, do we keep everything or do we let it go? And I think there needs to be a bit of, you know, a scale where you kind of have a balancing act, where you kind of look at what has been done and what can be done and see where you can expand it further. So rather than having less art, you know, having more around you and having more people activating and more creation, and just it in turn creates a better social environment and community. So that would be
It's
really
also
nice.
interesting, isn't it, that there are kind of cycles of taste. So what people may have
Oh,
loved
exactly,
now,
yeah.
in 10 years they stop loving, but in
Yeah.
20 years they come back to loving it again, you know,
Yeah.
like 50s fashion.
Yeah.
We can hope.
Yeah.
Paolo?
I was just going to mention a point that relates back to the moral rights of the artist and public art more broadly, not just graffiti or urban art, is the right, and I can't remember the exact wording, but it's the right for the work to be seen in the way that it was intended. You know, not basically, a lot of public art is site specific or placed in locations that create the artwork as much as the artwork has been created by the artist, because there has been that dialogue from design development through. And then after a very short period of time these days, all of a sudden that space gets redesigned. The dimensions of the space change, the way it's used changes, so that only a partial narrative of what was intended remains. And I think it's really important for the artists to know what rights they have in relation to discussing with councils or a local federal government, whoever has commissioned the work and whoever owns or has the duty of care of the work, to actually start a discussion about how that work is potentially treated, relocated, how the artist is potentially engaged to renegotiate that work and revisit the way that work is now, owning that space, which was never its own to begin with. So there's a real ambiguity, and I mean, I work for local government at the moment, and it's really interesting because I'm actually located in a building that has a 360 view of works. Everything's changing around us, and so we're constantly forced to renegotiate what we're going to do with all the artwork, where we're going to put it, whereas the council will just plonk it anywhere. It doesn't quite work like that. But the artists are actually quite silent, in a sense, you know, very few of them actually do understand or maybe have any idea of the potential of them having a voice.
Yeah. Well, I suppose that's, you know, there is the right, the moral rights of the artist, which does include the right of integrity. And if the work is going to be moved or put into a different space, then there's not a lot of room within the legislation for negotiation. But certainly it's at least there is a tiny bit, and it's a hook to actually try and achieve some outcomes for an artist. So we have used the legislation to achieve, you know, some, you know, I'm just thinking about, there was a big work in Melbourne. Part of the work was inside the building, part of the work was outside of the building. They were going to leave the bit that was outside of the building, and they were going to take away all the part of the work that was inside of the building. And it was all kind of part of one very big work. And so there was a lot of work went into negotiating with the company that was going to do this about the relocation of that work, and the fact that they couldn't just take the bits that they liked, that the work was a whole. So, and the moral rights legislation was used as the tool, I suppose, to achieve an outcome which wasn't perfect for the artist, but at least the work wasn't completely destroyed, and it was going to be relocated to a better, so it was in a better home than just having part of it just destroyed.
But I'm curious with that question, because I wonder then if the obligation is on the artist to then follow up, or it's actually on the...
Well, we have guidelines where the obligation is with us.
Yeah.
I think rightfully, because we're the ones making the decisions, or at least working with parties that make those decisions. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that it does need to come from us, and we do negotiate with artists, but, you know, they are guidelines. So, does it depend on who's in that seat, or does it, you know, I mean, it's not law, necessarily. And I think the artist just needs to maybe understand, I think we're making it hard for ourselves, but it needs to understand that maybe being more vocal and using that loophole can actually achieve a better result all round, because I mean they really are the visionaries. They understand about how that work can transform, not the techies that, you know, various government.
I can add another example to this, because just at the moment in Adelaide they've been redesigning Rundle Mall, and you probably all know the Flugelmann's work, and there's a very famous the Moll's balls, which are the spheres, and in relocating that, it was only to be 1 or 2 metres relocated because of drainage and stuff in the mall. Bert was consulted, moral rights were the prime concern. He didn't want the mall's balls to be shifted, but at the end of the day, it was all of that technical stuff that made it be shifted. And his moral rights was actually rehearsed, but there was never any strength in him having any capacity to stop what was going to happen. So I think, you know, it's the dilemma really in the public sphere that I don't know any answers to. You know, the artist had every opportunity to speak. He really had
didn't make a difference,
Yeah. Well, I think as with all laws, you know, they're open to interpretation, and the artist, you know, it's quite hard for the artist to be able to demonstrate that their reputation has been in some way harmed by, say, a relocation. So, and also most artists still aren't aware of moral rights. I mean, Bert Flugelmann does know them, and in fact, the other case I was going to mention briefly was the one that happened in Sydney, with what became known affectionately as the shish kebab, and the council. It was a series of what do they call? You know. Yeah, thank you. stacked. And it actually was a site-specific work that had been designed for a particular place, and the new incoming Lord Mayor didn't like it and just took it away. They sawed it off one night. And it was then, we held a candlelight vigil for it as it was happening. But then we went into bat for Bert because he is somebody who, or was somebody who knew his moral rights. And through sort of embarrassing the council over a series of meetings, finally they did agree to restore it, but in a different location. And actually, I mean, you know, not being Bert Flugelman, a lot of people think it looks great in that new location, but it wasn't where he designed it for, and so he felt quite unhappy.
We've just got one last question, because we've come to the end of our time. June, you had your hand up.
It might be too big a question to open now, but I wanted to go back to your initial statement, Ted, that art in the public realm is inherently political, or whether it's a question, because it seems to me we've moved to talking about different forms of politics here. There's the political in relation to how authorities respond to work of any kind, and then there's the political work in the public realm of the kind that Kelly's been talking about. And, you know, to me that's a pretty serious gradation, and I'm kind of interested in hearing more about political work. But as I say, I don't know.
Well, if you want to just answer that, Kelly.
Oh, I'd be happy to talk about
it. Oh, okay. I think it might be.
Otherwise.
I mean, what's interesting, I think, is we have been talking about this sort of pendulum swing between laws that are restricting artists to laws that are, in fact, protecting artists. And we're moving back and forwards in that pendulum through the whole conversation tonight. And what a great conversation it's been. Please join me with thanking Lady Bananas, with Robin, Tamara and Kelly.